Hey everybody, welcome back to our next lecture in Unit 4, where we're going to be looking at the Cenozoic era. So last time we talked about the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, which really brings an end to the Mesozoic era and then ushers us into our current geological era, which is the Cenozoic. And so we're going to be talking about some of the changes that took place after that Cretaceous extinction. So this GIF is just kind of going through and showing the breakup of Pangea over the last really, about 150 million years, kind of how we got to the position that we're in. And a lot of these changes that we see to our surface of the Earth today really started just in the last 65 million years. So the Cenozoic era is broken down into a couple of different periods, but the first period that we're going to look at is the Tertiary period. Now, we actually don't use the term tertiary that much anymore. It's kind of an older term that is still kind of tumbling around in the geological lexicon, but if we are going to still use it, we'll break it into its two subdivisions, very similar to what we did with the Carboniferous and the Mississippian and Pennsylvanian. So the Tertiary period is broken down into two subperiods, the Neogene and the Paleogene. The Paleogene goes from about 65 million years ago to about 23 million years ago, and the Neogene is from 23 million years ago to actually about 4 million years ago after the Pliocene. So the smaller subdivisions then of Paleogene and Neogene are epochs. That's E-P-O-C-H, epochs. And this includes the Paleocene, Eocene, and Oligocene, which are Paleogene, and then the Miocene and the Pliocene, which are Neogene. So why do we subdivide these? Well, if you'll remember that periods and eras are subdivided based on major changes in fossil faunas, right? We go from the Cretaceous to the Paleogene after a massive mass extinction, right? We end the Mesozoic and we start the Cenozoic. Well, the Paleogene is a little bit different than the Neogene in the fact that the animals that we have in the Paleogene are adapted to a very different climate than those in the Neogene. The Cretaceous period was very warm, and just because we have a mass extinction at the end of the Cretaceous doesn't mean we suddenly plunge into an ice age. Actually, the temperatures continue to go up in the Paleogene and start to cool off at the end of the Oligocene. So the Neogene is a time of our first Cenozoic ice ages, or at least expansion of more cold climates than what we saw in the Paleogene. So here we are looking again at the very latest Cretaceous, right before the Chicxulub impact. And a couple of things I want to point out. The orange bars that you see on this map are showing you where there's orogenic events or mountain ranges. You can see the Laramides uplifted in North America. You can see that we have the Jura Mountains, for example, in Europe, and parts of Asia are starting to uplift, but we don't have the Himalayas yet. India is still down in the Indian Ocean. The Andes are already active. But an important thing I want to point out is that the Andes actually extend all the way down into Antarctica. And Antarctica and South America and Australia are all still very, very close together. And this is important because as we leave the Cretaceous, we see a very big change in climate after we get into the Neogene, for example. But if we go back to the Cretaceous, and something I want to remind you of, is the way that oceans move. They don't just stand still. Above the equator, oceans rotate in a clockwise gyre. And that's true in this Paleotethys. It's true in the Pacific. And it's also true in our tiny little North Atlantic. And it's the opposite in the southern hemisphere. This is known as the Coriolis effect, right? So notice how I'm drawing these gyres right now. If we move those continents around, that changes how everything works. That changes how we distribute climate around the planet. And that's what we're going to be seeing for the next 65 million years from this point on. And then we go to the early Miocene, about 20 million years ago. Notice that we now have some major separation in between Antarctica and Australia and South America and Antarctica. We have seaways in between here. This is how temperatures change in Antarctica. Notice the Himalayas have uplifted. We've widened our Atlantic Ocean. So temperatures are drastically different in the early Miocene, or at the beginning of the Neogene, than they are in the Cretaceous. In just 50 million years, the entire planet's climate changes. Let's look at the influence of the Laramides, because the last thing we talked about with those is that they uplifted and drained off the western interior seaway, giving us the high plains. And that's certainly true. But the Laramides did more than just produce that. They also produced the Colorado Plateau, they produced the Basin and Range, and they contribute to all of our west coast tectonic activity. Now, the Basin and Range is what you're seeing here. Well, let me turn the pen on, excuse me. What you're seeing in this area. Notice around like Nevada and Utah, we have a lot of these very linear little mountain ranges with valleys in between. And what that's caused from is the stretching of the North American craton. The uplift of the Laramides, remember, which is a shallow subduction which pops up the Rocky Mountains, also pops up the entire Colorado Plateau. This results in the erosion of the Grand Canyon. All of these changes are happening from the Cretaceous into the early part of the Cenozoic. So we have the San Andreas Fault system in California, where we have plates moving in different directions. The Basin and Range and subsequent erosion of the Grand Canyon caused from that uplift of the Colorado Plateau, where here's the Basin and Range, Colorado Plateau. All of this is Cenozoic tectonics. Started in the Cretaceous, but really didn't show a big influence until we get to the Cenozoic. So as you uplift the Colorado Plateau, the Colorado River down cuts into that rock, producing the inspirational vast valleys that we see with the Grand Canyon. So how did this all happen? Because it's more than just that shallow subduction of the Farallon plate that we were talking about, going from the Sevier to the Laramide orogeny that uplifted the Laramides. It's a little more complicated than that, like everything. If we go back to about 30 million years ago into the Oligocene, and let's look at the west coast of North America, especially the Pacific Northwest. Okay, I'll use my highlighter here. You can see that we have a subduction zone going all the way up the western seaboard, which means the Farallon plate is being subducted underneath North America. Now, we do have some volcanic activity with the Snake River flood basalts, but if we were to go just a little bit west offshore into the Pacific, we would see the Farallon plates actually being created along this East Pacific rise here and the East Pacific rise here, and we have a transform fault in between where at this location these two plates are sliding past one another. Okay, but at the East Pacific rise, that's where we're producing new crust. So the Farallon plate gets produced and then very quickly, like within a few million years, gets subducted and destroyed. Okay, so we have a subduction zone, and we have a transform fault very, very close to it. So I want to pose the question, what would happen if you'd shallowly subducted a transform boundary and a divergent boundary without destroying them? You get an extension of the overlying crust. Because as we go from the Oligocene to the Miocene in 15 million years, we actually do just that. We subduct part of that East Pacific rise, which means underneath the shallow portion of the North American craton, the Pacific plate is still, and the Farallon plate are still being produced. We still have divergence going on here. If we were to X-ray through there, they're still moving apart. As a result, we have an extension of the Basin and Range. And that means the only place we're getting basaltic eruptions is now here in the Pacific Northwest. If we then jump ahead to the late Miocene, about 5 million years ago, our boundary is now here, which means this whole area is being extended and uplifted. So the San Andreas Fault is a really complicated thing, because the reason we have the San Andreas Fault, let's do this in green, is because we haven't destroyed that subduction or transform boundary. It's just been shoved under the rug that is North America. So the uplift of the Laramides has enormous tectonic ramifications on the western half of North America. It produces the Rockies, it produces the Basin and Range, it produces the Colorado Plateau, it produces the Snake River flood basalts in the Yellowstone hotspot. It produces all of these things from about 70 million years ago ongoing a bit into today. So how do you form that Basin and Range? Well, again, you're extending the crust. You stretch the overlying crust because there's divergence going on underneath it. So if we look at where a lot of these igneous provinces were 20 million years ago to where they are today, they moved about 210 kilometers. So North America got 210 kilometers wider over the last 20 million years. And that's because of the expansion of the basin and range. And it's kind of like a paper fan, or an accordion type thing, how it can be compressed and then it extends outward. And that's what causes those little incipient basin and ranges in mostly Nevada and parts of Utah. Okay. So that's where we see all of that. Uplift of the Grand Canyon, but not just that, but the whole Grand Staircase sequence of Bryce Canyon, Zion Canyon, Vermilion Cliffs, even Verde Valley over by the San Francisco Peaks. All of that is caused from the uplift of the Colorado Plateau, and rivers downcut. So if you uplift the crust, the river's going to keep cutting down. So we have all of these huge canyons that have correlative units at some point or another, all due to the uplift in the Cenozoic of the Laramides. Again, the San Andreas Fault, this is a remnant of that transform boundary that was shallowly subducted. We usually see images like this where it's just a big crack going through California. In reality, it's a lot more complicated. It's not just two blocks sliding past one another. It's dozens of small crustal blocks all moving in different directions, almost like a clockwork of gears. And that's why this whole area of California has so many earthquakes. It's such a seismic area because you have all of these rotational and sliding blocks. It's a very, very, very complicated sequence. So we look at the western portion of North America during the Cenozoic, and yeah, admittedly, it's kind of a mess. But that's because of something very, very strange that's happened where we have shallow subduction of plate boundaries. And there's active plate activity going on, or at least was, in many of those areas. So if you look at where our transform boundary is here, it extends. That is a continuation of the San Andreas Fault right down here into Baja. All of the volcanics we have up here are because of this remnant of the Farallon Plate, which we now call the Juan de Fuca Plate. But because we subducted all of that, we have the uplift again of the Colorado Plateau, the Basin and Range, the Rockies, Yellowstone, all of that. Well, let's talk a little bit about some paleogeography. If we go back to the early Cenozoic, about 55 million years ago, into the Eocene, Western Interior Seaway has just drained off. We haven't subducted everything yet. We have the incipient uplift of the Laramides, but we haven't started doing all the basin and range stuff. You can see the North American west coast looked kind of strange at the time. But in the place where we used to have that Western Interior Seaway, it's now a series of lakes. And it's still very, very warm. In fact, the Eocene is some of the warmest temperatures the Earth's surface has seen in the last 550 million years. So we have lots of lakes there, but remember, there was a lot of organic material there too during the Western Interior Seaway, during the Cretaceous. So when you have a lot of organics and you have lake deposits, that's prime areas today to find oil. And that is where we find oil. So we're looking in places like Wyoming, northern Utah, parts of Montana, Colorado, where there's a lot of mining going on. And it looks kind of like this. The Eocene deposits in the American West are usually very thin siltstones and limestones, and they have a lot of oil in them. We call these oil shales. And some of the units are also prime for finding Eocene-aged fossils. One of these is the Green River Formation that you find in Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado. These are formations of a very, very thin silty limestone that represents a series of freshwater lakes during the Eocene. And in these exquisite fossil packages, you find perfectly preserved fish, birds, bats, plants, stingrays, you name it, snakes, crocodiles, all especially in parts of Wyoming. So the Green River Fossil Buttes are an important national park that you can go visit, and it's great. You can prep some of these fossils out with a needle. The layers of limestone just peel off like pages in a book, exposing these beautifully preserved fossils underneath. So when paleontologists go fishing, this is what we do, is you go crack open some rocks and just find dozens and dozens of fossil fish. And they're really quite exquisite. This is bordering on Lagerstätten, where we are still getting tiny little fish scales preserved in absolute pristine condition. But it's not just fish. You also find, like I said, small little freshwater stingrays, as well as lots of plants, insects, and birds, things that normally don't preserve this well. We have beautifully captured ecosystems from the Eocene. So a nice window into what North America looked like, or parts of North America looked like, about 55 million years ago when temperatures were drastically different, much hotter than they are today. So here's the Paleocene, kind of the beginning of the Cenozoic era. And notice that we have a narrow but open seaway in between Africa and Europe, across the Atlantic, and in between North and South America. So we don't have Central America yet, and we haven't really closed off the Mediterranean. The Tethys is still somewhat open. And then we jump to the late Eocene about 40 million years ago, and we've started closing some things off. Not only that, but India has started moving further north and begins its initial collision with the uplift of the Alps and the Himalayas. Okay. As India nears Asia, we start seeing drastic changes in climate in this kind of western hemisphere. And as we close off the Mediterranean, we start seeing a very big change in the type of fossils we have being deposited there as well. So this is Nummulites. It's a fossil we've looked at in lab. This is a benthic foraminifer. Remember, forams are usually the size of a grain of sand. It's an amoeba that grew a calcium carbonate shell. Now, in the Paleozoic, we looked at fusulinids, which are those rice-shaped and sized forams, and we thought those were big for a single-celled animal. Nummulites is the largest. These get up to 3 centimeters in diameter, so over an inch in diameter, and we find these in the Mediterranean today. So these were living at the bottom of the Tethys, and today they're found in the limestones that formed around what is now the Mediterranean. So these are really, really useful for understanding the climates, the tropical climates that we had in the Tethys in the Eocene. Not only that, but when people first started finding, because they're big, they're 3 centimeters in diameter, so they're very easy to see. When people would see these hundreds or thousands of years ago, they didn't know that they were a single-celled marine organism in limestone. They didn't know what they were. They thought actually they were little like wafers, kind of lentils or something. And actually, if you look at the limestone that the pyramids are made of, you find Nummulites in those rocks. So the pyramids are built of limestone, chock full of Nummulites, and thousands of years ago, when people saw the pyramids, they thought that these little fossils were actually the remains of the food from the workers who built the pyramid. Little did they know that, no, these are single-celled organisms that predate the pyramids by tens of millions of years. But you can see all the little Nummulites in the rocks that make up the pyramid. Now, as India continues its migration north, and collides with the Eurasian plate in the Miocene, we see a drastically major change in climate from where we started out in the Cretaceous to where we are then in the Miocene. And this is one of the big things that marks the difference between the Neogene and the Paleogene. Once again, colliding a continent into another continent is not a simple mashup. There's rotation of crustal blocks, and it's a complicated system. But essentially what's happening is you have a lot of these kind of cross faults going through Asia as you uplift the Tibetan Plateau and uplift the Himalayas. India doesn't see many changes in and of itself, but the kind of the body of rock that it's colliding into does. In fact, most of Asia, Southeast Asia, kind of curves around as a result. And if we look at the uplift of the Himalayas today, you notice that India is nice and green and tropical until you hit this wall, and then you have the Tibetan Plateau here, which is all uplifted. It's very dry. It's very cold. It's a rain shadow effect. All that moisture gets dropped off on India, and then the cold winds then blow across Tibet. It's the same thing we saw with the Akkadian orogeny in the Silurian and the Devonian. The result of this is that it cooled the northern hemisphere, and this happened in a couple of different ways. First, the uplift of the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau changes the way that our weather patterns circulate around the northern hemisphere, especially over Europe and Asia. Not only that, but the rocks that we're uplifting, remember, a few tens of millions of years before this happened, that was shallow marine water. It was a lot of limestone. That limestone has now been uplifted into the Himalayas, and it's eroding. When you erode limestone, calcium carbonate, rocks, right, you start to dissolve them. And as they're being rained on and dissolved, they produce carbonic acid. Okay, it's a chemical reaction that occurs when you dissolve lots and lots and lots of limestone. To form carbonic acid, though, it also grabs carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and stores it. Now, if we're reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere starts to get colder because CO2 is a very good greenhouse gas. So we pull that out of the atmosphere, things get colder. Right now, we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing a lot of CO2 go into the atmosphere and things get warmer. And the opposite happens when you pull things out. So this starts to cool off the northern hemisphere. And if we look at climate throughout the Cenozoic, we notice that it's not just a single drop. It's what we call a stepwise climatic deterioration. We have peak warmth in the Eocene about 55 million years ago, and then it ultimately drops down to very, very cold conditions here in the Pleistocene. But it's not a straight drop. We have our first major drop, and then it stabilizes, our second drop, and then our third drop. So there's 1, 2, 3 major changes. So let's look at a couple of these, how this happens, but also, how do we know this? How do we know that climate changed this much? Well, at the top of this diagram, you see this symbol, delta oxygen 18. We're going to talk about isotopes a little bit and how we know whether the past was cold or warm. Here are the major events. We have our climate optimum about 55 million years ago in the Eocene. The advancement of the East Antarctic ice sheet and sea level fall, the first one starts about 36 million years ago. It stabilizes and grows about 15 million years ago. We then see ice sheets forming in Greenland, and then our most recent ice age just over the last million years or so. To understand how we know this, we have to talk about a thing called isotope fractionation. This is a way that geoscientists and paleoclimatologists can interpret ancient temperatures. This is oxygen 16. This is regular, run-of-the-mill oxygen you'd see on the periodic table. It has an atomic mass of 16. Okay, basic oxygen. This is oxygen 18, isotopic oxygen. It's 18 rather than 16, so it has 2 extra neutrons in its nucleus. It's heavier than elemental oxygen by 2 neutrons. Not that much heavier, but 2 neutrons heavier. Where do we find oxygen? We find oxygen in water. So if you're drinking water right now, then you might see, you might not see, but some of the water you're drinking has oxygen 16 in it. Some of it has oxygen 18 in it. Most of it's 16. But oxygen 18 is present in water, and it doesn't do anything. You'll also find oxygen inside of benthic foraminifera, the little tiny guys. Things like nummulites and fusulinids, and a number of other non-giant ones. There's 1 oxygen atom in every molecule of water. There are 3 in every molecule of calcium carbonate. Okay, so we can have benthic foraminifera that have a lot of O16, and we can have benthic foraminifera that have a lot of O18. So how do we get into fractionating this out? Okay, it all depends on what's going on with climate. So during warm conditions, water evaporates out of the ocean. Most of the water that evaporates has O16 in it because it's a little bit lighter. And then it precipitates out onto the continents, and because it's warm, that water runs right back to the oceans. Meanwhile, your foraminifera living in those oceans are happily building their shells with the water provided, and some are going to have O16, some are going to have O18. Now, during cold conditions, you precipitate that O16 water, you store it as ice on the continents. This leaves the oceans enriched in O18. And if the oceans are enriched in O18, then your benthic foraminifera are going to be making shells that are more enriched with O18 because the O16 is being stored on the continents in the form of glacial ice. Now, during a warm condition, all that O16 water is going to melt and it's going to run back to the oceans, and then we'll have a more equal ratio again of O16 to O18. That's isotope fractionation. It's the fact that we can separate out these isotopes based on evaporative and precipitative processes, and climate is the big controlling factor. So isotope fractionation doesn't control climate. Climate controls isotope fractionation. So a big part of this, though, is circulation of the oceans. Ocean circulation is very closely tied to climate. The location of your continents is going to dictate how your oceans circulate, how you move that warm or cold water around, and whether you form ice in one place or another. You'll see a record of that in the isotope fractionation of single-celled organisms like foraminifera. So, I'm curious how many of you have seen this movie. It's a bad movie. It's not a good one. However, it does bring up an interesting point. Okay, so the premise of the movie is that global warming begins to melt a lot of Arctic ice. As you melt Arctic ice, that cold, fresh water will then go into the Arctic and North Atlantic Ocean, and it's going to change the temperature of that ocean, and thus change how that ocean rotates and distributes temperatures. And that is actually pretty valid. That is a valid concern for climate change and how changing climates can have an influence on the planet. I mean, the fact that it happens in a day, I don't buy. But we call this phenomenon a shutdown in the global thermohaline circulation. Okay, so global thermohaline, so planetary, global thermohaline. That's the relationship of water salinity, how salty water is, and its temperature. Think about it. In the winter, you throw salt on the ice on the sidewalks and it melts it because salt changes the freezing and melting temperature of water. If you have salty water and you add a whole bunch of cold fresh water to it, you change how much warmth that water can hold. You change its insulatory properties. And the idea of this movie is that it can trigger an ice age. So the global thermohaline circulation system, or the THC for short, not the THC you're thinking of, essentially works like this, where our surface flow is in yellow and our green is our deep ocean flow. And this is today. This is how it works today. Now, if you move these continents around like they were a few tens of millions of years ago, this circulation system would look totally different. And we would be moving warmth and coldness around in a very, very different way. So all of this ties together with looking at isotope fractionation, which is how we understand the record, one of the ways we understand the record of ancient climates. It also, the position of the continents and what's going on tectonically plays an enormous role in this too, because it affects that distribution of temperature. Okay. It takes about 1,000 years for our modern ocean to completely mix, for the bottom waters to go all the way around the planet and then become surface waters again. It takes 1,000 years, so we're talking about a very slow process. I don't worry about that. Okay, so let's look at what's going on in the Middle Eocene. In the Middle Eocene, if we look at the South Pole, Antarctica, Australia, and the South Horn of South America are still very, very close together. This means that those Pacific and Indian and Atlantic Ocean currents just kind of come down towards those southern continents and then moves their way back up. Now, it's very cold at the time, but it's not completely frozen. Remember, this is in the Middle Eocene when temperatures are at an all-time high. When we go into the early Oligocene, which is not that much, long after, we've separated Australia, Antarctica, and South America just enough where we now have this Antarctic circumpolar current. This means cold water comes down there and it rotates around and it stays down there. In the early Oligocene, we start seeing our first drops in sea level for the Cenozoic era and the first advance of the Antarctic ice cap. So Antarctica, because of the separation of these continents, we change ocean currents and it goes from a refrigerator to a freezer. We call this the climatic isolation and refrigeration of Antarctica. So Antarctica's had ice on it since the Oligocene. And then finally, looking at what's going on about 2.5 million years ago, roughly, in the Pliocene, we still had an open seaway in between North and South America, which means more equatorial water could go back and forth. Once we form the Isthmus of Panama, which is Central America, we stop that current from going in between the continents. And this starts to produce the Gulf Stream. And it really kind of solidifies what's going on with our Atlantic Ocean gyre. This causes the Atlantic Ocean, to interact with the Arctic, with that cold seawater and sea ice that's isolated in the Arctic Ocean. So this is really where that day after tomorrow scenario starts to become a factor. And we know that it did start to occur about 2 million years ago. So notice we've talked about the uplift of the Himalayas. We've talked about the isolation of Antarctica and the refrigeration and freezing of it. And now the closing off of ocean pathways between the Atlantic and the Pacific, between North and South America. These three events directly correlate to when we see those drops in temperature in the Cenozoic. Okay, so the Tibetan Plateau and the Isthmus of Panama, these are what cooled off the northern hemisphere in the Cenozoic. The isolation of Antarctica cooled off the southern hemisphere. So 10 million years ago, water can move back and forth between North and South America. 5 million years ago, it can, but it's getting hard. And then present day, we develop the Gulf Stream and the countercurrent in the equator in the Pacific. This completely changes the way we distribute temperatures around the oceans and thus around the planet. And the record for that change in temperature is in isotope fractionation in foraminifera. So again, looking at this curve, this delta O18, that change in oxygen 18, if our oxygen 18 becomes more positive, more towards a positive number, that's a cold condition. More O18 means colder condition. That means the more O18 we find in foraminifera, because the O16 is stored as ice. During a negative O18, that means a warmer climate. So we go from the Eocene climate optimum to the early Oligocene drop. What's that? That's the isolation of Antarctica. We then stabilize climates, and in the Miocene, that's when this drop here in the middle of the Miocene, that is the collision and uplift of the Tibetan Plateau. And then our second major drop, that's the closing off of the Isthmus of Panama, Central America. So our first major drop, our second major drop, our third major drop. Climate optimum in the Eocene, East Antarctic ice sheet, Himalayan Tibetan Plateau, Isthmus of Panama, and then shortly after that we start seeing ice sheets in Greenland because we've cooled off that northern hemisphere. So we've seen throughout the Cenozoic how if we draw our boundary here, right across, let's put that in a pretty color, right across there, that's the boundary between the Paleogene and the Neogene. The Paleogene is typically pretty warm, but falling temperatures. The Neogene is very cold and very dry. What changed over 65 million years? The major changes in climates. So our next question is, how does this have an influence on life? What does this do to life from 65 million years ago to today? How does life respond to these drastically changing climates in this stepwise climate deterioration of the Cenozoic? So let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at Cenozoic life. Now that we've set the stage of what the climates were like and how they changed, let's kind of follow that same time scale, but focusing on the biology of these organisms over the last 65 million years. So let's look back at what's going on in the Paleogene and the Neogene. These are major evolutionary trends. So if you recall, the Paleogene period, or early Tertiary, is made up of the Paleocene, Eocene, and Oligocene epochs. General climate trends is continued warmth and humidity left over from the Cretaceous, though by the time we get to the Oligocene, that's starting to go down. So global climates are really kind of tropical to subtropical, and we start seeing that cooling again in the Oligocene. That leads us then into the Neogene, the second period of the Cenozoic, which is composed of the Miocene and Pliocene epochs. This is when a lot of our modern bird groups diversify. So today when you look outside and you see songbirds and ducks and geese and chickens and so on, those all diversified in the Neogene. Our grasslands also expand in the Miocene, and this also coincides with the evolution of a lot of our grazing mammals. So as grasslands begin to expand, we start seeing more bovids, so deer and other ungulates, hoofed animals that graze, start to evolve as well. And then we also have what's called the Great American Interchange, which is as cooling temperatures are going on in the Pliocene and the land bridge has opened up between North and South America, some of their mammals move north and some of our mammals move south. And so, for example, we have in North America, we have fossil sloths that are really large, and some of them migrated south. And we also have armadillos here, and some of those went south. So we see this exchange of animals from north to south across the Isthmus of Panama. So if we're going to look at Paleogene reptiles, or starting with the survivors of that Cretaceous Paleogene extinction, think about like turtles and snakes and lizards and crocodiles, things that we had in the Mesozoic that we still have alive today. Except because the temperatures were so much warmer in the Paleogene, we see larger reptiles. Because think about it, reptiles are cold-blooded. So if they're healthy in a warm environment, they'll continue to get very, very large. Today, the biggest snake in the world is the green anaconda. Both in weight and length, and they average out around 16 feet long, though they can get very big. The largest one in captivity that's ever been recorded was around 31 feet long and was about 550 pounds maximum. They can average around 16 to 20 feet. Here is in South America, a soldier grabbing a green anaconda by the tail. Based on the fact that the snake's turning around looking at him, I'm not sure how smart that is. But yes, this is a very big snake, and notice it's about, probably a good 6 to 8 inches in diameter at its maximum. In the Paleogene, however, we had this. This is Titanoboa. Titanoboa was 40 feet long and was 3 feet wide. This is an absolutely huge snake. This is a life-size model of one eating a crocodile. I was, I guess, lucky enough to see this exhibit when it was temporarily on display in Nebraska. I was there with a student, and that student got a candid picture of me. I didn't expect this exhibit to be there. I turned the corner, and there's this 40-foot snake. I don't like snakes, so they caught me looking very uncomfortable. But just to give you an idea of how big this thing was, there are two vertebrae pictured here. The smaller vertebra is to a green anaconda. Now, this vertebra itself is about as wide as a quarter or a 50-cent piece. And if you add the ribs to it around the sides, yeah, you're looking at a snake that's probably about 6 to 8 inches in diameter. Now here's Titanoboa. Notice that the green anaconda vertebra is sitting inside of it. When you add the ribs to this snake, you're looking at something that, yeah, it's going to be about 3 feet wide. This lived in South America where temperatures were incredibly hot, and this kind of adds to that temperature proxy that reptiles got huge. We also have turtles from the same fossil locality that are as big as billiard tables. So reptiles, our modern fauna of reptiles, got even larger after the dinosaurs went extinct. We also had some really cool birds left over from the Mesozoic. These are the forest rakids, or the terror birds. They ranged in size from about 6 feet to about 9 feet tall. This image here, you can see it running down a horse. Granted, the horse is about the size of a medium-sized dog, but still it's running down a horse. These existed from the Paleocene all the way to the Pleistocene, so just recently extinct, really. Large land birds, they didn't have much for wings or arms, but they could run things down, and then they had this very giant eagle-like beak to catch their prey. CT scans of the skull also suggest that they may have used their powerful beaks to snap them open and close very fast to produce a noise, a low frequency noise similar to emus and ostriches today for communication. So Gastornis, Forest racus, Diatryma, Kelenkin, all of these are well-known forest rakids birds, the terror birds. But really, the Cenozoic is known for its mammals, and in the Paleogene is when we get our first wide mammal diversification. Remember, mammals have been around since the Triassic, but this is when they really start diversifying. The earliest ones are very similar to what we saw in the Mesozoic, mostly insectivorous, so eating bugs and small seeds and small lizards. But by the time we get to the Eocene and the Oligocene, they've gotten much larger and much more diverse, and by today's standards, a bit weird looking. Some of our earliest Paleocene mammals, though, are mostly arboreal, so they're living in trees, things like Purgatorius, Curacus, and Carpolestes. These are actually kind of early primate to early rodent. If you actually look at the evolutionary tree of mammals, rodents and primates are very closely related to each other. So some of these similarities we see in these organisms between both groups are indicators of that evolutionary relationship. Again, most small mammals are best preserved by their teeth, but in some of the cases here, we actually have more complete specimens. We also see the evolution of whales in the Cenozoic. This starts in the Eocene with a group of animals known as the mesonychids, which are kind of polar bear-sized carnivores. In fact, Andrewsarchus is a well-known one from Mongolia. These animals were about 6 feet high at the shoulder, and they weighed nearly a ton. So actually, they're a bit bigger than a polar bear. They're the largest terrestrial mammalian carnivore ever, or at least that we know of. But they were probably amphibious. Now, I want to be careful with that term because I'm not saying they were an amphibian. I'm saying they lived an amphibious lifestyle, meaning they probably spent a lot of time in the water. So think of something like an otter, okay? That type of lifestyle where they would eat their prey and spend a lot of time in the water or along coastlines, but they were very, very well capable of living on land. So how do we go from this to whales? Well, if we look at the evolutionary links in the skull morphology, the limbs, we kind of trace this through numerous specimens and numerous species to go from the mesonychids to the proper toothed and baleen whales that we have today. Sharks. Megalodon. So in the Miocene, we had this incredibly large shark known as Carcharocles carcharodon, or Megalodon, as some people call it. Now, I want to be clear that Carcharodon Megalodon Megalodon is the genus, is the species name. There is an animal with the genus name of Megalodon, and it's a giant Jurassic clam. And I don't think that's what anybody's talking about when they make these, silly giant shark movies. So in this diagram, the green outline, that's Carcharodon calcareus. That's the modern day great white. In the purple, that's Rhynchodon typus. That's the largest fish alive today, and that's the whale shark, which are really cool and kind of harmless. And then we have a red and gray estimate of size for Carcharodon megalodon, a kind of a conservative and a maximum estimate. And that's because these fossils are based exclusively on teeth. And so when you take the teeth, we reconstruct them into the jaw of what this animal looked like. We have a bit of a room for error there with the size. So it's either like 15 or 20 meters long. Still incredibly huge shark. A couple of years ago, Shark Week on Discovery Channel decided to post a silly fake documentary suggesting these things could still be alive. I can tell you, no, they're not. They're extinct. They've been extinct. There are no more left alive. That was just a silly documentary that unfortunately fooled a lot of people. And of course, we still have movies about these giant things that, they've been turned into just gigantic monsters. But I mean, it's a big shark, no doubt about that. Horses also have their diversification throughout the Cenozoic, and actually how we see horse evolution in the Oligocene is really interesting because if you look at the earliest horses that we see in the Eocene with Eohippus, it's about the size of a house cat, and they've got lots of little toes and tiny little teeth. And then when we get into the Oligocene, we have Myohippus, which is a little bit larger, has fewer toes and larger teeth, and then that diversification just goes crazy in the Miocene, Pliocene, Pleistocene. So the trends we see with horse evolution is they get larger, their teeth become more robust, and they reduce the number of toes to be a more grazing hoofed mammal lifestyle. And this coincides, notice this change really starts happening around the Oligocene. That's when we see the expansion of grasslands. So their teeth change as a way of eating a different kind of vegetation. and their feet change so they can walk in these newly evolved grass fields rather than the landscapes, the brushy landscapes they were living in before. So horse evolution throughout the Oligocene and the rest of the Cenozoic very, very closely mirrors what's going on with climate. Whales are the same kind of trend. We talked about the mesonychids, but then you go to Pakicetus and Ambulocetus, and it's not until we get to things like Durodon that we're really looking at something that's spending its entire life in the water. And again, the trend here is an increase in body size, reduction of limbs, and a fully aquatic lifestyle. With our last major split in whales happening about 35 million years ago with the Mysticete whales and the odontocete whales, so the toothed whales and the baleen whales. And then we get into the most recent geologic period of the Cenozoic, and that's the Quaternary. And the Quaternary is really the last 100,000 years of Earth history. And North America has a very unique Quaternary vertebrate fossil fauna in the Pleistocene, our megafauna. These include animals that are heavily boned, very thick fur, and these include things like the large cats and wolves, like dire wolves and smilodons, or the big saber-toothed cats. It also includes very, very large deer, like Megaloceros, that had a rack. It's an elk that had a rack that was 12 feet wide. Mastodons and mammoths. We had North American rhinos, giant cave and short-faced bears, glyptodons, which are armadillos the size of cars, and then also huge, huge bison that used to roam in incredibly large herds. So here's Smilodon, what a lot of people call the saber-toothed tiger, but it's not actually a tiger. It is a type of cat, but they're pretty distinct from true tigers. They lived from about 3 million years ago to about 10,000 years ago. Very large dominant predator, huge, huge fangs. They're one of the few mammals that actually have serrated teeth. And those scimitars, we actually find a lot of them broken, so we think these things actually use their teeth a lot, and it was risky. You could break your teeth being a Smilodon. But their jaws also open, as you can see in the photograph here in the lower part. Their jaws actually open wider than 90 degrees. So they would use these powerful, wide opening jaws to wrap their mouths around the neck of some prey and quickly bite it and let go. And those teeth would act like a knife, and it just cut the jugular right open. And so then they'd use their very strong upper body strength to knock this prey down and hold it down. Notice how big this shoulder blade is. As we said with early vertebrates, shoulder blade's a good indicator of how strong your upper body is. That's a huge shoulder blade. So these things were probably not good at running long distance, but were good at pouncing on something, making the kill quick and clean, and then eating. Mammoths and mastodons are Pleistocene and sometimes a bit older proboscideans, or elephant relatives, that we actually find here in Winnebago County and here in Oshkosh. There's been a number of mostly mammoth finds in Oshkosh. Done a little bit of research on those. But what's the difference between a mammoth and a mastodon? Quite a lot, actually. Mammoths lived from about 1.6 million years ago to about 3,000 years ago is when the last mammoth went extinct. They're about 13 feet high at the shoulders, so they're pretty big. They're much larger than African elephants or Asian elephants. Their teeth, they only had 4 teeth in their mouth really at a time, so one on each side in the lower and one on each side in the uppers. And their teeth are these big, massive structures that have ridges in them. To me, it almost looks like a loaf of bread that's been squished. They would then they'd use these teeth for eating softer vegetation. So when we look at where we find mammoths and what kind of vegetation was in that area, they were eating grasses and things. Mastodons, 4 million years ago to about 10,000 years ago, so they died out a little bit longer. They're about 10 feet high at the hip. They're at the shoulder. They're a little bit more flat horizontally. And the name mastodon means massive tooth. And if you look at their teeth, it's these great big molar-like structures. And their tusks stick out further rather than curl like a mammoth's. I actually think mastodons were eating harsher vegetation, so roots and scrubs and brush and things like that. So as we started going into a more frozen environment, mammoths really were a little bit more adapted to that, and mastodons were more adapted to the plains. But you can find both of them around here. I mentioned we had some very large bear in the Pleistocene. Arctodus is the short-faced bear. It stand about 11 feet tall when it was up on its hind legs. In the diagram here, I've got a comparison with a brown bear, a grizzly, and a short-faced bear. They're a lot taller. Weighed about a ton, and they had really, really long legs, so they could probably run down things like bison and horses and people. And they lived from about 70,000 years ago to about 12,000 years ago. And then we lose all of our Pleistocene megafauna. And we don't really know why. There's other large mammals at other parts of the planet, and we don't seem to see those going extinct at the same rate or time. So what was the cause of this extinction? Was it, and it's a very specific extinction, it's just the megafauna. Is it caused from human migration as humans came into North America? Or is it more a factor of late glacial climate change, like as the temperatures were starting to warm up? So is it an anthropogenic cause? Is it hunting from early humans? Well, there's some good evidence for that. We do know that early humans in North America were hunting large mammals. That was a major resource they used. One of the things about large mammals, though, that we have to be cautious of is their reproductive cycles. So humans, for example, our gestation period, how long we're in our mom's tummy, is 9 months. For an African elephant, it's 2 years. So that means if you happen to kill off a couple members of that population, it's much harder for them to reproduce and repopulate than something that has a shorter gestation period. And bigger mammals tend to have longer gestation periods. So if you kill off a couple of young, there goes the whole next generation. So it's possible that they were out hunted. It's also possible that disease played a role and that climate played a role. It's also possible that it was a mixture of things, indirect causes like diseases carried by humans. Early humans did have dogs hanging out with them, so maybe there was some cross-contamination with diseases and viruses that way, plus the direct hunting, plus climate. But here's an interesting thing. If you look at the differences between the diversification or extinction of large and small mammals throughout, let's say, the last 3.5 million years, you notice that your small mammals just keep going up, and your large mammals go up, and then right around the end of the Pleistocene, they just drop to nothing. So this isn't a mammal thing, it's a big mammal thing. And that's why we think, because we do have evidence of humans hunting, that at least that played a role. Was it the absolute only role? Hard to tell. But there is direct evidence that humans were hunting large megafauna. That could be all it takes to really upset that ecosystem. But this is all going on, remember, just in the last few million years to a few thousand years ago. And I just want to take a moment to reflect the time that we've covered so far in this class. After the first exam, we started at 13 billion years ago at the origins of the universe, and now we're talking about things just a few thousand years ago. So we're going to go ahead and pause there, and next time we're going to talk about the Pleistocene and Holocene a little bit more. What else was going on during the time of this Pleistocene megafauna with these heavy-bodied animals? What kind of world were they living in a world that was mostly covered, periodically at least, by ice?